one thing we're going to talk about is forgiveness. That's the main thing we're going to talk about. And so here's a picture of the Amish. As you can see, they use horse and carriage. In the United States, they're pretty common in certain places. You would have signs that would show a picture of a carriage, and it would warn you that you're sharing the road with the Amish, and to be careful and look out for them. So, you know, America actually has a high respect for Amish people because of their adherence to their values, and that's something that you don't see a whole lot of in the United States. A lot of people give up their values for money or popularity, and to see someone that will just completely stand apart from the world. No electricity, no television, no telephones, and it's really amazing for us to see that. So, but one day they made the news in a very tragic way. I don't know if in Australia you heard about this, but in October 2nd, 2006, there was a school shooting that was unbelievable. We've had many mass shootings in the States that are very unfortunate, but this one was the one that stands out in memory. Because of all people, why would anybody target the Amish? They don't even have guns. They're pacifists. In other words, they don't fight. They don't go to war. Yeah, and so...
They haven't even done anything. True. They're just living as nature intended.
Yes.
There's no reason for that mentality.
Exactly. The whole United States was in shock, and not only that, but around the world. So, I'll tell you real briefly what happened. It tears my heart out to even think about what happened, but there's a man who was not Amish, but he lived in this predominantly Amish community. And when his wife gave birth to a baby, it was a baby girl, and she died 20 minutes after the birth. And he was so heartbroken, but he buried it. He didn't share that with anybody. But he was so angry at God. He could not forgive God for taking his baby girl. And he wanted to get back at God. He wanted to hurt God in the worst way. So he thought about the Amish people. He couldn't get closer to God than the Amish, he thought. And so he decided to injure and hurt God by hurting his little girls. So he studied the school that was near his home, a little school, and he watched them for quite some time, and he finally made a plan. One day he drove up to the school, and he, to make the story short, sent all the adults and the little boys, or all the boys, out of the school, and he locked up the school, and he was going to hurt those little girls. He wanted to get back at God by injuring the precious little girls. They were from 5 to 13 years old. And thankfully, because one of the teachers ran it off as fast as she could, she was able to find a telephone and call the police. But the police couldn't get there in time to prevent some serious injury. But he was going to do worse to those girls, so they're thankful. The gentleman knew the police were there, and so he instantly started shooting, and he shot 8 of the 10 girls, and 5 of them died. I read a book about it, and being a volunteer firefighter, and I go and I work scenes where people get hurt, whether it be a car accident or a medical emergency, fire. You know, I know what it's like to be there, and I know how difficult it can be. And so when I read the story about what these volunteer firefighters went through in dealing with, you know, something horrible like this, it really touched my heart. So I wanted to study a little bit more about the Amish. And one way I did it, I actually watched a movie. And I don't know if you can get it here, but if you can watch it, I highly recommend it. It's called Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. It has it in America.
Yeah, but not here.
That is unfortunate.
You can get the movie here, but with no caption.
I am so sorry, because that's very powerful movie. it doesn't tell about the shooting, which I don't want to go into the shooting because it's a horrible thing. What the movie talks about is forgiveness. If somebody had shot my son, it would be very hard for me to look at that other person's family and care about them. Would it not? It would be very hard because my grief would be so great, I wouldn't even know how to deal with it. But these people have a culture of forgiveness that allowed them to work through it. As soon as this happened, within the hour, when they found out who it was, some Amish elders from that very church went over to the house of the woman whose husband had shot the children. They went over there, knocked on that door, and they thought, oh, you're going to hurt us. And they said, no, we love you, we care about you, we forgive you. We are here, can we pray with you? She could not believe that. That was not normal, you know, and she said, why are you here? Go away. What? But as time went on, it was so powerful. Those Amish people wrapped their arms around the woman who lost her husband. You see, when he shot those children, the last bullet wound went to him. He killed himself. So the woman lost her husband. She had two boys who lost a father. How do you deal with that? How do you tell your boys, your father is dead, and he shot those children, and we now have the world looking at us. We have every camera in the world, every news crew sitting in our front yard. How do you tell your children that? And the Amish understood that that family was going through more than they deserved. And so they were working with them and encouraging them. This man also had a father. How would you feel as a father if your son did something so hideous? And that was your son that you loved. So one of the elders sat down with the father and held him for an hour, just holding him while he cried. That was the same afternoon. Well, you know, at first the news crew was very fascinated by the story of the shooting, of course. You know, the news, they were like, who would shoot Amish people? And so they were all there. They were trying to wrap their minds around this story and to get it out to the world. But then they were seeing this strange behavior, something that they've never seen before. And that became the big story. I think that's pretty cool. I think that is really cool. So I'm going to read just real briefly out of the book that I read. It's called Think No Evil. I marked it, but now I have to find it. Okay, so these are actual photographs from the scene of the crime. And these are relatives and very close friends and neighbors of the little girls that they loved. And this is the funeral procession for one of the little girls.
A lot of carriages, wow. Is that one for each girl? So all of those horses is one of the girl? Is that how many actually went?
Well, because they had no cars, they would take their buggies. And there were Amish people from all around that came. And so these are like families, different families. And as you can see, there's news crews there taking video. There's officers protecting everybody. And the procession was miles long, and the people standing along the streets were miles long. And there was actually rumor of protests coming. There were some people that didn't think it was right for them to forgive that family. They wanted the Amish to be angry and to retaliate and at least be mean. So the story actually came from...
It's bad for their health, though.
There was the volunteer fire department was actually within view of the school of where it happened. It was within half a mile, not quite a kilometer, and they could see the school. And so the volunteer firefighters were standing at the station, and they were watching the procession going by. and it said there was hundreds or more lining the streets. A motorcycle gang came up wearing full biker gear, looking tough and out of place. They stood, paying their respects as the procession came. One man came up to this firefighter. He had tattoos up and down his arms, and he looked as though he was hard as a rock. He was the kind of person you would want to mess with, or even make eye contact with. Rob found out that the gang drove about, with Rob being the firefighter, he found out that the gang had driven about 150 kilometers on their Harley Davidsons. They had heard that there might be some protesters, so they wanted to show up to stand between them and the Amish. The firefighters thought, you can't judge people by the way they look. This biker shared his story. He said, you know, I had a son that was killed by a drunk driver 7 years ago. I've never forgiven that guy that killed my son. I never forgave him. And you know what? Maybe I should. If these folks can forgive that man who shot those little girls, maybe I should forgive that guy that killed my son too. He gesturing with his hands. He said, look at this. Just look at them. Maybe I should forgive too. Wow. That's pretty impressive. So millions around the world are watching. And something you need to realize about Amish people, they do not want their photographs taken because they see that as making an image, breaking the second commandment. They, in their homes, it's very humble. They do not have pictures on the walls, any little figurines of, I don't know, angels or animals. No, they don't put any of that up because that's an image. And they feel like that's in violation of the second commandment. But as a group, they decided they would make an exception this time. They would allow the world to take photographs of them and video and interview them because they saw it as an opportunity to share.
So is that because the photos show and it's a descriptive image of what's happening for people around the world to see and share what's happening and get that message out there?
Yeah. Yeah. They thought that this was maybe God's way. It's not God's way. They thought that they could take something horrible and turn it for good. Taking something horrible and making it into something that they can share God's love with. And I just think that's incredible in itself. How easy it would be to feel sorry for yourself and not even think about anyone else because your world just came crashing down and you really want to feel sorry for yourself. I know when I lost my brother, not because of something that somebody did, but because it was a sudden death, I felt so bad for myself. I cried and I didn't want to see people and I had to go through that process of grief. But these people who are not accustomed to video cameras and cameras at all, they said, come. And they shared why they were forgiving. And that became headlines around the world. Even the Muslim culture, even those that, not all Muslims are the same, I understand that, but there are some that are very antagonistic against Christians. They said we have the highest respect for the Amish for this very reason. And I thought that was a testimony. What got me is that that's their testimony. That's not our Adventist testimony. There's something wrong with that. So I was very fascinated by this book and the movie, and I started doing some research on it. I wanted to understand more about why they forgave. And then I asked myself questions. Okay, would I be so quick to forgive? Like I mentioned, what if somebody shot my kid? Nothing is more precious to me than my son. I don't know what I would do. You know, I always call myself a she-bear. If somebody did something to my son, I could be like the mama bear, and I could be very vicious. I always warn people. I try to be gracious, and I try to understand that people are people, and I tell my son that, and you know, just try to be kind. But every now and then, I feel that she-bear deep inside welling up. So, wow, what would I do? Would I be so quick to forgive? But then I started asking additional questions. That's a major event. What about the little things? Do I hold grudges against people for things that they did that are nothing? Do I have a forgiving spirit? Am I as loving as Jesus is? And do I need to change? I'm afraid that, at least in the United States, and I dare say probably in many parts around the world, we think about us, we think about our rights. And as Americans, that is our, kingpin. We are very proud of our rights. We worked hard to gain our rights, and we want to keep our rights. And so I'm afraid that that desire for our rights has overstepped into our Christian life. And we as Christians have allowed, we always talk about the world influencing the church. We've allowed things coming into our church that shouldn't be there. Maybe we're not eating like we should, or maybe we're not watching things that we should. Maybe we're not dressing like we should. Maybe our music taste is not what it should be, because if we've allowed the world to influence us. Well, I dare say that forgiveness is probably one of the areas that we have also adapted to the world, because we hear the world say, well, that's just not right. We can't let that happen. Well, we hear a lot about revenge, and so we need to evaluate our hearts and become less like the world and more like Jesus. So let's talk a little bit about the root of the unforgiving spirit. This is a text, a Bible text that was, wait just a moment.
Do you want to put a cushion there?
I know.
You want a cushion?
This was a Bible text that has been very challenging for me. It says, when you are praying, if you are angry with someone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven will also forgive your sins. But if you don't forgive other people, then your Father in heaven will not forgive your sins. For many years that text bothered me. I thought God would forgive us if we just asked him to, no matter what. I thought that we can't change until we asked him to forgive us, right? But here, it looked like God wanted us to change in order to gain forgiveness. So I always had problems with that idea. So I started thinking, well, what is the root of anger and unforgiveness? Why are we angry? It's because we're thinking of ourselves, right? We don't care about others. We don't care what other people think. We're very angry because we are trying to protect ourselves. What is the opposite of love? Let me ask you that.
Hate.
Hate. That's a very natural answer, but it's not hate. Any other ideas?
Selfishness.
Perfect. Thank you. Stephanie's right. It is selfishness. Love is caring so much about other people, you don't think about yourself. The opposite of that is not caring about anybody at all but yourself. That's really what it is. So, we look at what Jesus said. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Love him with all your mind. This is the first and most important commandment. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Everything that is written in the law and in the prophets is based on these two commandments. All right, so we see that. And we think, okay, well, what is the law? What is the law? What is it based on?
That's very dangerous.
The law is based on love. Right? It says it right here. Okay, so we talk about love. How does this relate to forgiveness? This text says, you have heard what it was said to people who lived a long time ago. They were told, do not commit murder, anyone who murders will be judged for it. But here's what I tell you. Do not be angry with a brother or sister. Anyone who is angry with them will be judged. So anger is a sin. I may never kill a person. I hope I never do. I don't even want to accidentally run over a pedestrian. That's been my biggest fear. I would never do that. I can't even imagine that. But it's very easy for me to be angry at someone. Very easy for me to be angry. And sometimes that anger lingers. I can hold that anger for a long time. And I'm told it's not any different. Okay? So, when you're angry at a person for something that you think they did, or maybe they did do, and you're holding that in your heart, and you're actually cherishing it, you're allowing it to fester and grow, how can God forgive you if you won't let that go? You can say, God, forgive me for lying, cheating, taking something I shouldn't have, saying something I shouldn't have. But meanwhile, I'm very angry and I'm holding on to that anger, that hate, which is sin. God cannot forgive me. He can't forgive me because I haven't let it go. When I finally wrapped my mind around this, I finally understood that first verse that I had struggled with for so many years, where it says that God can't forgive me until I forgive somebody and then come back. Then he can forgive me. Well, that makes perfect sense now, because if I'm so angry at somebody, that's hate, that's not love, and I'm holding on to it, how can he possibly forgive me? Because I haven't asked him to. I don't want to let that go. So, anger. What does it look like? I wouldn't say it's very pretty. It's not handsome at all. Does that look like God? There will be people that will tell you, yes, that does look like God. And perhaps it's because we as Christians have given that wrong image. And I would hope that none of us here would see God like that, especially when we think about God as our creator, God as we talked about this morning, and the things that we saw this afternoon. If we look like that, though, even if it's just in our heart, we are not reflecting God's image. Wow. You might remember the parable of the king and the unforgiving servant. Let's see here. There we go. There was a man who owed the king a lot of money. And the king wanted to deal with that debt. And the man said, "Oh, please, king, please forgive me. There's just no way I can pay that debt." So the king was touched. And he said, "Okay, you're forgiven." He didn't even lay out a payment plan. He just says, "You're forgiven. Don't worry about the debt. It's covered." The forgiven man was so happy and pleased with how things went, and he was so thankful, right? However, he found a man that also owed him money. It wasn't very much. Let's just say it was maybe $5. He says, "You owe me money." The man says, "Well, I don't have it." He says, "Oh, yes, you will. Give me that money." And the Bible tells us that he actually grabbed him by the throat. Well, that doesn't sound very nice, does it? It certainly doesn't sound loving. And quite threatening. What was the point of the story? Do you remember?
It was to show like the level of forgiveness and how ungrateful someone can be that they get forgiveness and might not give it.
Exactly. We have hurt God so much. Think about every little thing you've ever done. Every little thing. It doesn't take much to break the law, does it? Every time you thought, a thought about yourself, where you stepped away from God. was wrong. And then all the things he might have done to hurt his other children. We are so guilty of so much. And when one person does us one wrong, we can be very mean about it. We can be very angry and hateful, and we may even retaliate. Sometimes we just retaliate by not liking the person for the rest of their life. So, there you go. You know, and here Jesus tells a story. He's like, you need to forgive. I mean, when you have been forgiven so much, how can you not forgive somebody for so little? How can you not? And I share this with you because that's what the Amish teach. They teach this. They study this. This is their culture. This is a point of, they live on forgiveness. They refuse to hold on to this anger because it is a sin. It is wrong. I don't know how often I've heard people speak in church and preach on how wrong not forgiving is. I've heard it's not good for you, you need to forgive, it's something you need to do, but it's more of a suggestion. You know what I'm saying? It's not actually saying you have to forgive, because if you don't, it's wrong. It's a sin. The Bible tells us, while we were God's enemies, He made us His friends through the death of His Son. Surely now that we are His friends, He will save us through His Son's life. And then we're reminded later in the Bible, in Colossians, it says, bear with each other and forgive each other. If someone does wrong to you, forgive that person because the Lord forgave you. That sounds all simple, right? Much harder to do in practice. Someone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. And you know that no murderers have eternal life in them. Ouch. That's pretty strong, isn't it? This is how we know what real love is. God gave His life for us, so we should give our lives for our brothers and sisters. That's very deep. We are not to harbor any anger or hate or sense of grudge, angst, resentment. We can't hold on to those things. It's wrong. Forgiveness is great medicine. And under the picture, it says, you mean I have to take the forgiveness pill? That's hard. When I was a young lady, I had to make a decision because I was very angry at a person, a particular person. It consumed me. It was all I could think about. And I don't know why it was bothering me. I had always had problems with this person in my heart. I don't know if maybe God was just putting it in front of my face so I would deal with it, or if I was just so angry I just let it fester and let it grow. I don't know which it was. But I remember going on a little hike into the woods, which is the best place for me to pray. And I sat down on a rock and I said, oh, I'm just so angry. I'm just so angry. And I told God how angry I was and I wanted retaliation. And He distinctly said to me, you have to forgive him. I was furious at God. How could He tell me that? Didn't He understand how angry I was and how it hurt? And then He said, but you have to forgive him. You have to forgive him. So I said, well, that's just impossible. I have no desire. I don't want to forgive him. There's nothing, there's not an ounce of anything in me. There's not a fiber in my body that wants to forgive him. And God said, but you have to forgive him. So I got up. I was trying to run away. I got up from the rock and I was walking around trying to, maybe a different, like Balaam. You know, Balaam, he would pray at one spot. He didn't like the answer God gave him, so he went somewhere else, hoping God would give him a different answer. So I did the same thing. I walked away from the rock and I was like, trying to negotiate this with God. And finally I said, okay, but you're going to have to help me. I can't do this. You're going to have to actually do it for me. And He said, just say the words. Just say the words. Like, well, that can't be too hard. So I said, okay. It was harder than I thought. I said, forgive him. It was gone. It was amazing. It was amazing.
Oh, it was just going like that.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, so on my way home, I was almost dancing down the road, and I arrived home, and I was just so excited. I had never felt so happy in my life. It was gone. And but I saw him again a few years later. I saw him. Satan knew I was very angry at him, and so he whispered in my ear, "It's him." And I started to allow that thought to come back in my mind where I hated him. But then I said, no, I forgave him. I forgave him. It's over. And I actually can speak to the guy. I can actually talk to him. And I actually care about him. We're friends on Facebook. I follow him. So what I'm trying to say is that we all have somebody that has hurt us. We may not even realize it, but if there's somebody you don't like, maybe you need to dig into your heart a little deeper and see what it is that you don't like. Maybe it's something that you have to let go of. And when you do, you'll feel better. You know, sometimes, I know I did with that person, when you want to be angry because it's like you're punishing that person. The angrier you are at that person, it makes you feel better because you're getting back at them. But most of the time they have no idea. And the only person that's suffering is you. Studies have shown that physical health, I mean, it can cause high blood pressure, an increased heart rate, more muscle tension. You can get sick more often, go to the doctor more often, take more medicine. But that's not even touching the emotional and psychological health. Amish people forgive because they believe that it's God's way. God's way. They have a story they have passed down from generation to generation, and the Mennonites share it as well. They actually have printed books on this man called Dirk Williams. This was a story from back in the 1500s. He was an Anabaptist. Anabaptists were chased down by people. They were punished. They were killed just because they thought you had to be baptized again. Simple thing. But it was a threat. And so Dirk Williams was an Anabaptist, and they had a price on his head, and there was what they call a thief hunter, and he was tracking him down. He was trying to catch him, turn him in to the authorities. So they're running through the snow in the wintertime. They're running in, and you know, Dirk was just trying to get away from this guy, Dirk Williams. He was trying to get away to save his own life. He ran across the frozen river, and as soon as his feet hit the snow, he actually turned back to look to see if the other guy was doing okay on that ice. Well, the man actually fell through the ice into the river, and he was, of course, in a bad way. I mean, you don't want to be frozen. And there was also current in the river, and it was actually trying to pull him down. So Dirk Williams could have said, "Huh, there you go. I can run away now. He'll never get me. He's in the river." Instead, he said, no, he's going to die. He turns around and pulls him out of that ice. It actually nearly killed Dirk Williams because he had to get in the water to pull him out. And it nearly killed both of them. So he pulls them out of the river. They lay on top of the ice, and they're both wet, they're both freezing, and they're both trying to recover. And you would think that Mr. Chaser would look over at Mr. Dirk and say, "Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. Let's just pretend I never saw you," right? No. Mr. Thief Chaser said, "Yes, gotcha," and arrested him. Turned him over. He was tortured and burned at the stake. Now, some people would say, well, obviously he should have been like a rabbit and run away from the fox. He should have just taken off. He should have just said, this is my chance to live. But the Mennonites and the Amish, they have passed the story down as a hero. This man is a hero to them. They said, this is how we should behave. Let me see if I can read something here. I wanted to read actually the actual words because I thought it was very meaningful. But okay, basically, their concept is this. If Dirk dies, he knows Jesus. Jesus is in his heart. If he dies, he has eternal life. This man does not have Jesus in his heart. When he dies, he has no eternal life. He didn't care about what happened to him because he knew what would be his future. But he loved that man enough to die for him because he wanted him to know Jesus. He wanted to give him a chance. And so that's the Amish way. They have heard this story over and over and over again. You forgive, love others. Who cares about what happens to you? You know Jesus. They may not know Jesus. That is their whole passion. That is their mission. I'm afraid that I haven't been raised as a Seventh-day Adventist to have that heart. And that's unfortunate. I mean, I was raised to hear about mission. We need to share Jesus. We need to go, you know, in the United States, we're always told we need to go to Africa or to the Amazon. You know, we need to go out in the mission field and share Jesus. But we don't talk about our heart. If we all behaved like Jesus did, Jesus would already be here. If we all had the heart of Jesus, he would take us home. So, wow. You know, it's hard for us to accept that concept because, you know, when somebody has a car accident, 2 people are in the accident, 1 dies, you find out that the accident was because of a drunk driver. And it's very natural for someone to say, well, who died? Hopefully it was a drunk driver. I have said it myself. You know, this poor innocent Christian person who's a, you know, maybe a head deacon in his church and, you know, is very supportive of the work and, you know, a good neighbor and great father, and then you have the drunk. Society needs more people like this Christian man and not more like this drunk. But we have it all backwards too often. There's another story that comes from the Amish community. I want to share actually 2. One is actually about a deaf child. This man was driving, and he was not Amish. He was visiting an Amish neighbor, and they were very close friends. So he was driving up the driveway, and something he didn't think about was their deaf, actually it was a deaf granddaughter. She was 6 years old. The deaf granddaughter was not accustomed to looking both ways on the driveway because they don't have cars, right? So she jumped out right in front of the car. He ran over her. He was horrified. And the ambulance came, but the baby, she's 6 years old, but she died right in their arms before they even could get her in the ambulance. That man was so upset. This was not just some stranger. This was his neighbor's grandchild. He knew her very well. And worse, he felt worse because she was deaf, you know. He's like, how could I do that? So he went home. He shuts the door. His wife was home. He didn't say a word to the wife. He walks into the bedroom, shuts it, and locks it. And the wife had no idea what had happened. So she knocks on the door. He's like, what's wrong? Are you okay? He couldn't even tell his wife. He couldn't even say the words. I just ran over them. I mean, he couldn't say the words. The Amish neighbor called and said, may we speak with, his name was Amos, can we speak with Amos? She said, well, I'll try. So she walks to the door. She said, so-and-so wants to talk with you. Oh, that was worse. Oh. So she comes back to the phone. I don't know what's going on. He's not coming out of the room. He said, well, I'll tell you what happened. So the neighbor told her what had happened. And she was devastated, and she understood what was going on. That man's heart was ripped out. He couldn't believe he did that. He didn't want to. This was something that he couldn't believe that he had done. But the Amish community wrapped their arms around him. They even, they invited him to the funeral. He's like, how can I go to the funeral? That's impossible. But he did go. They actually asked him to go tell some of the relatives that lived in another town. Can you go tell him for us? You want me to go tell great-granddaddy that I killed his great-granddaughter? Yes. So he did that. And the church, the entire church, children included, made a special book with love notes and sent it to him by mail. It was very thick. He opens it up. He's like, why are they doing this to me? They should hate me. They should take me to court. In the United States, we're very sue-happy. We sue for everything. You stub your toe on a rock in somebody's yard, you sue the person that owns the lawn. And it's just our society. And yeah, this was not happening. He said, I was so grief-stricken, and their love helped pull me out of my grief, helped me to deal with what I had done. He said, if it were anyone else, and they had taken me to court, I'm already feeling awful, even with their love. I don't know how I could even live. So sometimes when that's on a great scale. On a small scale though, sometimes we may be angry at somebody, but maybe we don't understand why they did that to us, or why they said what they said to us, or why they didn't do what we thought they should have done. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they were hurting. Maybe they need your forgiveness to help them not be hurting anymore. Another story, I'll skip the story. There's so many stories I could share, but I'll just skip that story. But we need to start strengthening each other and start seeing the other person's pain. Don't just see your own pain, and don't see the other person as some kind of monster. You remember the story about Stephen in the Bible? Stephen was one of the deacons in the early church. And he was sharing the gospel, much to the angst of the church leadership at the time, Jewish leaders. And so they were trying to talk him through and convince him he needed to stop and that he was wrong. And then he just preached the most beautiful sermon, which angered the Jewish leaders, and they decided that they just couldn't stand it anymore. They had to kill him. So while he is standing there, surrounded by angry men that were throwing rocks at him, he looks up into heaven and he says, forgive them. That's love. To be able to say to God, as people are killing you, to forgive them. So we have lots of Bible examples of forgiveness. Here's a Bible verse that tells about it. It says, he fell on his knees and cried out in a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And after Stephen said this, he died. So this comes back to the concept of helping somebody when they have hurt you. And it says, but now you should forgive him and comfort him to keep him from having too much sadness and giving up completely. So I beg you to show that you love him. I wrote to you to test you and to see if you obey in everything. So it's our Christian duty to forgive. Because when we forgive, we comfort that person and we actually pull them up toward Jesus. We can pull them up out of that miry clay. Now sometimes, like with me, when I forgave that individual, that man, I saw him again, and I instantly had that, oh, there he is. And I wanted to think about that for a little bit and actually consider hating him, but then I decided no, I had already forgiven him. Satan knows us very well, and he knows if you've ever been angry at a person, he's going to try to get you to be angry again. And actually, with the Amish people, that the moms, the very mothers that had to go through the loss of their child in the most gruesome way, they would tell you that they would forgive every day. They would cry, because their hurt was very real. I mean, forgiveness didn't mean that they didn't hurt. It was just a way to lessen their hurt. And when they, they would forgive. It's like, okay, take it away from me. And then after about an hour, they would get angry again. And so they would ask for God's strength to help them to forgive. They had to forgive again and again. And one lady said, I have to forgive every hour, every hour, every hour. And that's what we need to do sometimes, because Satan will come in and it's like, hey, that's wrong. He did, you know what? He was wrong. And you just have to say, I have to forgive him, and pray about it again and surrender it. And the more you do that, the easier it will get. Satan wants you to be bound by the chains of anger and resentment, and it can be a very strong temptation. But you have to make that decision. So the question is, what is God's people going to look like when he returns again? Do you remember that angry face that was there? Is that what God's people are? Is that how God's people are going to look like when he comes again? Is it going to be anger, or is it going to be love? You're going to look like this? An accusing finger at somebody's face? That's the decision that you're going to have to make. And it may be a matter of prayer. In my work in deaf ministry, I come across many deaf people who actually have a lot of grudges and resentment. Understandable. I know too many people that have gone through unimaginable things. Unimaginable. I know a young man who was actually in a mental institute his entire childhood because he was deaf. That was all. He actually showed me documentation that was about this much, a file, and I went through it and I read it. I could not believe what I read. It kept saying, there's nothing wrong with this child, he's just deaf, he needs to go to a deaf school, signed by a doctor. So they moved him to a different mental institute. They did another study. They said, there's nothing wrong with this child, he needs to go to a deaf school, he needs to go home. He was moved to another mental institute. He was in his institute for all of his 18 years. He didn't feel loved because his mom and dad weren't there to hold him, to love him, to teach him, to share. He did see them. They came and visited, but come on. Seeing your mom and dad once every 2 or 3 weeks for an hour, it's not the same as being at home with them, right? And so he had resentment. I can understand that. There are other people that I've met where, you're deaf, let's hide you in a room, the company's coming, we don't want anybody to know that we have a deaf child. That's painful. The stories go on and on and on and on and on and on. And there's a lot of resentment. Maybe it's time to let that go. But, deaf people are not the only ones that go through a lot of pain and suffering. And it's not only people that may not understand deafness that inflict pain on deaf people. There's all kinds of things that happen. Are you familiar with Corrie ten Boom?
Yes.
Very powerful story.
Carly, here is go.
Corrie ten Boom was not a Jew, but during World War II she was arrested and put into a prison camp because she and her father and her sister were hiding people that the Nazis were looking for. So they were arrested, and she shares in her book, The Hiding Place, an incredible experience of what it was like to be in that prison. It was awful. It was unimaginable. And her sister Her name was Betsy. Betsy was forgiving the soldiers. Every time a soldier came along and kicked them, or threw food on the ground instead of handing it to him on a platter, she would forgive them. Right then. Not Corey. Corey was angry. She's like, it's just not right. It's just not fair. Why are they doing this to us? All we were trying to do is help people. And Betsy would say, we have to forgive them. Corey did not understand her sister at all, and she watched her sister lose weight and become frail and weak, and then weaker and weaker, and finally she was near death, and then she finally died. She died 10 days before freedom. Corey was so heartbroken. Betsy was all she had in the world, and she lost her sister. But at the same time, Betsy's desire to forgive plagued her. It haunted her. And she finally understood that she needed to forgive as well. So she became a speaker. She was traveling around different places, and she was talking about forgiveness and how we needed to forgive. And thinking about it now, in Europe, as war-torn as it was, it would be very it'd be very easy for people to be angry at somebody. They lost so much. Everything was in shambles. And so she was talking about forgiveness, and she writes this story. It was in a church in Munich that I saw him. A balding, heavy-set man in a gray overcoat, a brown felt hat clutched between his hands. People were filing out of the basement room where I had just spoken. It was 1947. That's 3 years after her release. So her wounds were very fresh. And I had come from Holland to defeated Germany with the message that God forgives. And that's when I saw him, working his way forward against the others. One moment, I saw the overcoat and the brown hat. Then the next, a blue uniform and a visor cap with a skull and crossbones. It came back in a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights, speaking of the prison camp. The pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor. The shame of walking naked past this man. It was this man. I could see my sister's frail form ahead of me, ribs sharp beneath the parchment of skin. Oh, Betsy, how thin you were. You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk, he said to me, which is where I was at concentration camp. How was a garden there? You didn't remember me. I had to do it, she said. I knew that. The message that God forgives has a prior condition. Remember that verse I shared with you? In order for God to forgive you, you have to forgive. Well, the man went on. He said, since that time, I've become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me for the cruel things I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well. His hand came out, and he said, will you forgive me? I stood there, I, whose sins had every day to be forgiven, and I could not do it. Betsy had died in that place. Could he erase her slow, terrible death simply because he asked? It could not have been many seconds that he stood there, hands stretched out, but to me it seemed like hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing I ever had to do. Because I had to do it. I knew that. The message that God forgives has that prior condition, that we forgive those who injured us. If you do not forgive men their trespasses or sin, Jesus says, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. And still stood there with the coldness clutching my heart. But forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can do regardless of how the heart feels. Jesus, help me, I prayed silently. I can lift my hand, I can do that, but you have to supply the feeling. So woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched out to me, and as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, sprang into our joined hands, and this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. And I cried, and I said, I forgive you, brother, with all of my heart. To me, that's very powerful.
Wow.
Because it wasn't because she knew she had to, but she didn't just say, okay, yeah, I forgive you. But she cried, and she said, I forgive you with all my heart. It wasn't there before. God supplied that. For a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I had never known God's love so intensely as I did then. And that's it right there, isn't it? When we forgive someone, we actually experience God's love. So, my challenge to you is this. Think about it. You don't have to do it now. But when God brings a person's name to mind, or as you think of someone, or maybe just that pain, think about it. Are you angry against someone? Do you hold a grudge? Is it a husband or a wife? Or maybe an ex-husband or an ex-wife, ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend? Somebody hearing? You may have to ask God to show it to you. And this message has really made a difference in my life because I come from a long line of grudge holders. And, you know, it's in my DNA. And it was taught to me. And I did not realize that I was doing the wrong thing. I did not realize, I would be out mowing the grass, and I would spend the entire time thinking about how somebody did me wrong. What I needed to say to that person, it was a great time to just think. And instead, I should have been praying for that person. Just pray for that person. Because if the person is not doing something right, he needs God's help, right? Or she does. And so I have been trying to remember this and put it to heart, because somebody does me wrong sometimes, and sometimes I misunderstand, and so much of it is actually just a misunderstanding. Or sometimes I cause a person to react in a way that hurts me. So it's very important that we remember that we have got to forgive. We have to forgive completely and quickly, openly. And if you can't do it, well, that's fine. God will supply everything that you need. I mean, Corrie ten Boom went through something horrible, but she did it. And she didn't just do it. She did it with, I don't know, how would you describe it? She did it fully and completely and even more. So, let's go ahead and pray. Dear Father in heaven, thank you so much for forgiving us. We don't deserve it. We are nothing. You're dust. You could have simply gotten rid of Adam and Eve at the very beginning. You could have actually not even created us, knowing that we would be bad children. And you did it anyway because you loved us. And you still love us in spite of everything. Help us to be forgiving. Help us to love people, no matter what. Give us that love in our hearts, because it's not natural, it's not there. We need your help. Help us to not be afraid to look into our heart and examine some things that might be there. I know there's a lot of rubbish there in each one of us, and I ask that you help us to look there. Help us to look at the right places and to clean out the rubbish. Give us your love. And forgive us for failing again and again. In Jesus' name, amen.